So in the last few videos where I talked about autism and ADHD, I didn't talk all that much about how it affects me as a musician. Let's get into that. I've talked about how ADHD makes socializing in general difficult. It's also made being a musician very difficult, especially during my formative years. Generally speaking, when you start playing an instrument, whether you take lessons for it or you're learning by yourself, at a certain point, you want to start playing with other musicians, form a band with friends, learn to play some songs, maybe even write your own, or at least seek out opportunities to play with other people. Me, on the other hand, I was mostly a bedroom guitarist from the ages of 10 to 19. I'm pretty sure during that time, the only times that I played my guitar in front of people were at my music school's student recitals. I wanted to play music. I wanted to be in a band more than anything. I wanted to be like my heroes. I wanted to be like Eddie Van Halen, like Jimmy Page, like Richie Blackmore. I wanted to be like all those guys, but my fear of rejection always got the best of me, as it did with any other social interaction. And the one time I actually did join a band, kinda, during this period, seemed to justify that fear. When I was a sophomore in high school, one of my friends asked me if I was interested in joining this band that he was leaving. He played guitar for that band, but he wanted to focus on his music. He asked me if I wanted to play guitar. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I would love to be in a band. And my audition went well, I thought. I thought I connected well with the other musicians in the band. And then 2 months later, I was kicked out before we ever played a show. And I was crushed because it seemed to justify the notion that me being my authentic self is a bad thing. And instead of motivating me to succeed and maybe even start my own band and prove that, yes, I can do this, I lost all of my confidence. I also don't remember sharing any of the same musical tastes with anyone, save for my dad, who got me into most of my favorite music. I didn't know anyone who knew who Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, Tower of Power, or Steely Dan even were, and not knowing anyone who shared similar interests made it very difficult for me, because I didn't know how else I was supposed to find common ground with anyone. When I was in college, I also struggled to adapt to my environment, both musically and personally. I was a jazz major. I wasn't into jazz, and I knew nothing about jazz, but all I was doing was jazz. And not just me, but an entire program full of people, a lot of whom do love jazz and have been playing and listening to jazz for years. I, on the other hand, didn't even know what a jazz standard was. I didn't know anything about improvisation, chord progressions, scales, or how to play with a band. I didn't even know what a DAW or an audio interface was until after college. And I remember on one of my first days as a student in the jazz program, showed up late to a rehearsal for one of these chamber groups. There were 2 guitarists in this group, myself and one other person. We started playing a tune, and the band director pointed to the other guitar player, signaling for him to take a solo, and he proceeded to improvise this unbelievable solo. He had great tone, great articulation, lines that were both melodic and technically impressive. And my jaw dropped. I remember just staring at him being like, what the fuck? And then when he finished his solo, the director then pointed at me to take a solo, and I panicked. I didn't want to take a solo after witnessing literal fretboard wizardry, but I had no choice but to just do the best that I could, because I couldn't say no, and it was not good. I remember finishing the solo and then just sinking down into my chair and bending my head down so I didn't have to look at anybody. After we finished playing the song, I ran out of the room and started crying because I was so discouraged, embarrassed, overwhelmed, overstimulated. A positive that came from this was that when I ran out and started crying, the guy that is now my best friend followed me and comforted me and gave me a hug and told me everything was going to be okay, which was an act of kindness, the likes of which I hadn't really experienced much up to that point, if at all. And that guy's still my best friend, so It wasn't all bad. But that incident kind of set the tone for me for the rest of my time in jazz school. I spent most of my time there just trying to acclimate myself to jazz for the sake of keeping up with everyone around me, that I spent no time working on the music that I truly resonated with and that I truly enjoyed. And for the most part, I was afraid to talk about any music outside of jazz with most of my peers. I didn't spend any time working on developing a musical voice that truly felt like my own, that I truly connected with. Every time I played, I just felt like I was being dishonest. Felt like I was trying to shove myself into a mold that I just didn't fit. I kept trying to convince myself that it would benefit me, and musically, yes, in some ways it did, but at the cost of me usually feeling like a shell of myself. Even outside the confines of music school, I still struggled. Where I went to school, there was, and still is, a great DIY independent music scene. A lot of great local bands and artists started in that scene, including a lot of people I'm friends with. Deep down, I really wanted to be a part of a community like that. The music was unique, creative, inviting, compelling, and the environment was welcoming in a way that jazz just wasn't. But I had developed such an inferiority complex from jazz school that I could barely bring myself to jam with anyone in any context. And by the time I graduated, I felt pretty directionless. It was also 2020, so I couldn't do much of anything. But I felt like I hadn't gained anything by that point because I had been focusing on the wrong things. I thought I was focusing on the right things, and since then I've just been trying to figure out, who the hell am I? I've been actively gigging, whether it's with cover bands or with weddings or doing cruise ship gigs or doing what I'm doing now on a national tour. But the thing that drove me to music in the first place was you could create your own voice and carve out your own place. And I spent so much time not focusing on that. And in the last video, I talked about not having an identity, and musically for a long time, I really felt like I didn't have an identity. I'm still trying to figure it out. I haven't put out any of my own music. I've recorded some demos, but most of the time when I talk to people and they ask me if I write my own music, and I say yes, and they say, "Oh, what kind of music do you write?" And I say, I have no idea. I have no idea. I don't know what this is. When you mask so heavily in so many aspects of life, you lose the idea of who you are without the mask, and that can lead to some pretty heavy trauma because you straight up don't know who you are anymore. And musically, I feel that's exactly what happened to me, because I cared more about fitting in and being seen as this thing that I wasn't, because I hoped that would substitute for my glaring lack of an identity. I was convinced that my real voice, my real identity, whoever that is, would have been shot down or ignored if people saw it. I literally gaslit myself into thinking that just being myself wasn't good enough for anyone.